In this lecture, I plan to introduce the Greek world, and that is more than just modern Greece. The Greek world in the time of Alexander the Great, who was born in 356 BC and died in 323 BC, is a much wider geographical range than it is today. Both sides of the Aegean were inhabited by Greeks. That includes the western shores of Asia Minor today, Asiatic Turkey, the northern shores of the Aegean. Greek colonies were in southern Italy, Sicily. There were Greek colonies all along the shores of the Black Sea. In eastern Libya, the island of Cyprus was part of this Greek world. And so what we want to look at is what the Greek world was like in the generations just before Alexander the Great. Essentially, what happened to Greece after the Peloponnesian War in 404 BC. We will follow up with lectures on Persia and Macedon, and as will become clear, Macedon is not synonymous with Greece. Macedon is part of a wider Greek world, but we'll reserve Macedon for later on. What we wish to do here is to explain how did the city-states of Greece by 360 BC end up in a political stalemate, almost a case of diplomatic and military exhaustion, which is sometimes compared to what happened to Europe between 1914 and 1945. That is, the Greeks had fought a long series of wars in the 5th century and early 4th century BC, so that when Philip of Macedon came to the throne in 359 BC, to everyone's surprise, Philip, within 10 years, would emerge as the man who would unite Greece. And no one would have anticipated this, that Macedon, ruled by a series of kings, kings from the so-called Argead dynasty, would unite the city-states of Greece under their control. And the way the Greek city-states responded to Philip II, and to some extent to Alexander the Great in the first 2 years of his reign, is really quite at odds with the way the Greeks had rallied against the Persian threat in the early 5th century BC, that is the invasion of Xerxes in 480 to 479 BC, in which the great king of Persia threatened to subject the Greek city-states to the Persian Empire. And to answer this question, we really have to look at the results of that Peloponnesian War. In 404 BC, the city-state of Sparta won the Peloponnesian War. This is sometimes difficult for many classical historians to accept because sympathies generally rest with democratic Athens. But Sparta in 404 BC was in a very good position to provide a unity to the wider Greek world, at least in the Aegean world. Maybe not to the Western Greeks in Sicily and Italy, but at least in the Greek homeland and the associated areas in the Eastern Mediterranean and Black Sea. Sparta had many virtues, and in the course of battling Athens between 412 and 404 BC, in the later stages of the Peloponnesian War, the Spartans, in my opinion, forged the types of institutions necessary to provide a wider unity to the quarrelsome Greek city-states. And as I've stressed in lectures I've done with the teaching company before, Greek political identity was based on the polis, the city-state. The plural of that is polis. That is the institution that really resonated with Greek citizens, and these polis were often quite small, with citizen bodies of only 5,000 adult men, and the city-state was very much a face-to-face society in which the institutions, the political institutions, were administered by the citizens themselves, meeting in an assembly, which elected magistrates, as well as a council, an advisory council, the so-called boule, and these were the institutions that had made Greek civilization go. What Sparta offered was a series of alliances, not only to her traditional allies in central and southern Greece, particularly the so-called Peloponnesus, the southern peninsula of Greece, and very often the original Spartan alliance system is known as the Peloponnesian League, but also to the many other Greek city-states that had been freed from Athenian oppression or had concluded alliances with Sparta in the later stages of the Peloponnesian War. For one, the Spartans had a tradition of leadership of various Greek city-states and had evolved a system of commanders under various titles, admirals known as a navarch, that could command coalition forces of Spartan citizens, various allies, a class of people known as perioiki. These are the free residents of the Spartan state who were not full citizens, as well as mercenaries, and weld these forces into an effective professional army and navy. In 404 BC, by anyone's estimation, the Spartans had somewhere between 50 and 60,000 men under arms. And down to 386 BC, the Spartan state maintained a professional mercenary army, about 20,000 hoplites, those are the heavily armed infantry, 2,000 cavalry, and a navy of 200 warships, the so-called trireme. This was an enormous expense. It would have cost the Spartan state, by my estimation, 1,760 talents for a campaigning season of 6 months. A talent is a huge sum of money, and certainly by the standards of the ancient world, this is an enormous expenditure on a essentially standing army and standing fleet. The Spartans had the resources. They had the whole former Athenian empire of the Aegean, plus their many Peloponnesian allies, and they were collecting taxes, especially import-export duties in the Aegean world. They were collecting contributions from their allies. Most of this paid in Athenian coin of the 5th century BC. And under the command of Spartan officers, these forces were drilled to professional standard. Many historians think that Sparta, in many ways, obtained a bitter victory. That is, in defeating Athens, her social and economic institutions were essentially undermined. And these are premised on views of Sparta as some type of oppressive slave society, which is greatly overdrawn in the sources. I've argued this in previous courses with the teaching company. And instead, Sparta in, say, 400 BC, in many ways looked like early Rome. She stood at a head of alliances that extended from the southern Peloponnesus all the way to northern Greece, centering on the Gulf of Corinth. There were Spartan citizens, her free residents, the perioiki, that is, people living in southern Peloponnesus who were members of the Spartan state but not full citizens. She had many allies, and in this way, her political structure resembled very much Rome in the 4th century BC, with citizens, Latin allies, Italian allies, all commanded by excellent officers who owed their loyalty to a Spartan state, to a system of education that in many ways produced some of the finest soldiers and athletes in Greece. Furthermore, the Spartans had known nothing but a string of victories. They had defeated the Athenians on their own element, the sea. And above all, the Spartans really were committed to consulting their allies when they made war. Quite in contrast to the Athenians, who ran their alliance structure very much as an empire. And when Athens was defeated in 404 BC, few states wept for the defeat of Athens, which had come to be regarded as a tyrant city. So Sparta, from 404 to 386 BC, in my opinion, had an opportunity to forge a wider unity for the Greek world. The king at the time, or you have to remember, Sparta had two kings from two separate families, the Eurypontid and the Augead families. The king at this time is a man named Agesilaus II, who came to the throne in 400 BC and died in 360 BC. This king experienced the rise and fall of the Spartan hegemony, where Sparta was essentially hegemon, that is, the leader of the various Greek states. Agesilaus was a charismatic and dynamic king. He knew how to command these coalition armies. He carries out important fiscal reforms. And in some ways, Agesilaus is almost a model for the type of charismatic kings, warrior kings you get in the Hellenistic age. Sparta had won the Peloponnesian War against Athens by cutting a deal with the Persians. The great king of Persia at the time, a man named Darius II, and then later his son Artaxerxes II, both of these great kings were very concerned in controlling the western half of the Persian Empire, that is, the regions that were west of the Euphrates, and particularly the troublesome cities of the Greeks of Asia Minor. These cities had been liberated by the Athenians in the 5th century BC and incorporated into a naval league or empire. And in 404 BC, the Spartans had to deliver on a treaty they concluded back in 412 BC, in which the Persian governors of Asia Minor, and there were two of them at the time, promised to furnish financial support and naval support to the Spartan fleet in the war against Athens. But in return, the cities of Asia Minor that had been liberated by Sparta and Athens back in 479, 477 BC would have to return to Persian rule. Both the Spartans and Persians had concluded this alliance out of a cynical pragmatism, and when the war was over, the Spartans were really ill at ease in turning the Greeks over to Persian rule. In fact, the Spartans went to war against Athens, proclaiming freedom of the Greeks. And they took that claim very seriously. Soon after the war, the Spartans supported a man named Cyrus the Younger, who was the brother to the then reigning king Artaxerxes II. Cyrus, as the younger son of a Persian king, knew that his options were rather limited. He could easily be disposed of by his elder brother. And what he did was Cyrus recruited some 13,000 Greek mercenaries with the blessings of Sparta. And to these forces, he added his own levies, and he made a dash in 401 BC to seize the throne of Persia. He marched from the city of Sardis in western Turkey today, almost to Babylon, and on September 3rd, 401 BC, his army won a smashing victory at Cunaxa, in which the Greek mercenaries played a decisive role. And we'll be discussing this battle later on in the development of Greek warfare. Those mercenaries gave Cyrus the decisive edge to defeat his brother. Unfortunately, Cyrus was killed in the battle, and you had this rather peculiar situation where the great king of Persia won the battle. The great king of Persia lost the battle. His brother won the battle, but was killed, and the Greek mercenaries had no paymaster or reason to be there, and they therefore essentially marched out of the Persian Empire on their own. King Artaxerxes had managed to murder the primary leaders of this mercenary force, but the Greeks simply elected new leaders, including Xenophon, who wrote an anabasis, a march up country is the Greek word, that is, the retreat to the Black Sea and eventually back to the Greek world. Xenophon's anabasis is important for several reasons. One is it's virtually a manual on how to conquer the Persian Empire. And many would think that Alexander the Great had read this and had a pretty good idea of how weak and divided the Persian Empire was. Second, it was a remarkable indication of how important Greek heavy infantry were. And from this point on, Greek mercenaries were in high demand among the great king of Persia, his governors, who were known as satraps, and even his rebel governors, or the pharaoh in Egypt, who had rebelled from Persian rule in 404 BC. Greeks in the thousands were now employed in Persian and Egyptian armies. In any case, this effort to unseat Artaxerxes II was part of a policy by the Spartans to keep control of those Greek city-states of Asia Minor. They were not going to hand them back under the terms of the Treaty of Miletus in 412 BC. And the result was that Artaxerxes essentially was at war with Sparta. And while he was preoccupied fighting his brother Cyrus and the repercussions of that rebellion, the Spartans had sent armies into Asia Minor under various commanders. The first one was a man named Thebron, who freed a number of the cities, and he was followed by another commander called Dercyllidas. And then finally, King Agesilaus himself undertook an expedition to Asia Minor. These forces drove back the Persian satraps. Agesilaus got onto the plateau of Asia Minor, and Artaxerxes really had no choice but to fight Sparta and the various Ionian city-states, and he did it by diplomacy rather than by war. Agents were sent into the Greek world, to Athens, to Thebes, to Corinth and Argos, the other leading Greek city-states, all technically in alliance with Sparta, and these four city-states rose up to fight the Spartans in what is known as the Corinthian War, which raged from essentially 395 down to 386 BC, when it was settled by a general peace, very often known as the King's Peace or the Peace of Antalcidas, who was the Spartan diplomat who negotiated the settlement. The Corinthian War was important for several reasons. As soon as the war erupted in Greece, Agesilaus had no choice but to be recalled to Sparta. He had to bring his expedition back to the Peloponnesus, and a series of complicated battles were fought around the Isthmus of Corinth, that is the isthmus that connects the Peloponnesus to central Greece, and it ended in a stalemate. There were some very significant innovations in tactics, but neither the Spartans nor the coalition of the other four states could achieve a decisive victory, and eventually the war was settled by diplomatic means. Second, Athens, who had been defeated in 404 BC, Athens gained Persian money, rebuilt her city walls and long walls, received a fleet from one of the Athenian generals, Conon, who had fled to Persia at the end of the Peloponnesian War, and with that fleet had defeated a Peloponnesian fleet off the city of Knidos in 394 BC and reestablished an Athenian presence in the Aegean. And Athens hoped to regain something of her hegemony in the Aegean world as a result of the Corinthian War. They did gain some significant advances. They got a hold of some of the northern islands in the Aegean. They concluded alliances with former members of the Athenian Empire. But on the whole, the Athenians were really rather disappointed with the outcome of the Corinthian War. Thebes, Argos, Corinth, each aspired to supplant Sparta as the hegemon or the leader of mainland Greece. They too were disappointed by this war because in 386 BC, all of the participants, along with King Artaxerxes II of Persia, agreed to a general peace. It is known in Greek as a koine irene, a general peace that ended all outstanding issues and had some very, very simple provisions. Athens was independent, but that was about it. The Athenians really didn't regain much in the way of territory, but the Athenians were at least free from Spartan control. Sparta gave the Ionian Greeks, the Greeks of Asia, back to Artaxerxes II. Those cities were relinquished, cities that had been liberated almost 100 years earlier. Sparta, on the other hand, was essentially hegemon of Greece. The Spartans were put in the position of interpreting the freedom and autonomy of the Greek city-states, and they used this settlement in 386 BC to knock down any potential rival in mainland Greece. Peloponnesian allies were reorganized essentially into tax districts by King Agesilaus II. Spartans issued orders to cities, and if they didn't obey, they took direct action. In the year 382 BC, a Spartan army under a commander called Phodrius was moving towards northern Greece against the city of Olynthus to break up a league there, and in the process seized the city of Thebes and garrisoned it, and broke up Thebes and the local regional league, the Boeotian League, which was put under Spartan control. Spartan actions became so high-handed that by 378 BC, the Spartans were resented and disliked even more than the Athenians. And many of the Peloponnesian allies, the Thebans, who were now under Spartan control, cities such as Argos and Corinth and the Peloponnesus, would welcome any effort to knock down Spartan power. And in 379 BC and 378 BC, events brought this about. And very quickly, the Spartans found themselves taxed and unable to maintain that hegemony over mainland Greece. In Thebes, there was a democratic rising. In 378 BC, after less than 3 years garrisoning the city, the Peloponnesian garrison was butchered, and Theban Democrats, led by a man named Pelopidas, threw out not only Spartan rule, but reunited the cities of Boeotia, 11 of them, into a democratic federal system and declared their independence. Olynthus and the Chalcidian League in northern Greece reconstituted itself. It had been defeated by Sparta and had been broken up. It was now reassembled as a rival league. Thessaly in north-central Greece, an area that was also under Spartan influence, was united by a figure known as Jason of Pherae, was elected Tagos, or league commander of the Thessalian League. He organized a mercenary army and the 2,000 federal cavalry into another regional league to oppose Sparta. So all of a sudden, Sparta found herself facing 3 major federal leagues in central and north Greece opposed to her aspirations as hegemon of Greece. The Spartans had also offended the Athenians. A Spartan commander by the name of Phodrius tried to seize the Athenian port at the Piraeus and botched it. And in 379 BC, the Athenians responded by not only supporting the Thebans, but also issuing an invitation to her many former members of the old Delian League, that is the naval league Athens had organized in the 5th century BC, to hook up with Athens and establish yet a new alliance structure. The Athenians had limited success. The cities in Asia Minor could not join because they were under Persian rule. Many of the former allies of Athens were very wary of the Athenians. They knew the Athenians had a tendency to boss them around, to impose tribute. But nonetheless, by 378 BC, Sparta now found herself facing 4 large regional confederations, a naval league under Athens, and 3 inland leagues headed by Thebes, Olynthus, and Thessaly, opposed to Spartan ambitions. The Spartans really could not maintain their position for very long. And at 371 BC, the Spartan army, under the then senior Agiad king, Cleombrotus I, went down in a decisive defeat at the Battle of Leuctra, a town in central Greece. And that battle was important for several reasons. One was militarily, and we'll discuss that in a coming lecture. But politically, the Spartan army had been decisively defeated on its own element by the Theban army. This was a result of the tactics and inspired generalship of a man named Epaminondas, a Theban commander who had organized the Thebans and their allies into effective hoplite force, and to a large extent were using Spartan tactics. The battle was celebrated across the Greek world as a turning point. Some 700 Spartans fell in the battle. These would be Spartans in Perioike. Dedications were set up across the Greek world, including at Delphi. There's an epigram that has been found which celebrates this. This is a poem which reads, "When the Spartan spear held sway, and then it fell to Xenocrates' lot to carry the trophy in honor of Zeus, fearing neither the army from Eurotas," that's the river near Sparta, "nor the Laconian shield," that's the district of Sparta, "Thebans are superior in battle," proclaims the trophy at Leuctra, "that announces the victory won by the spear. Nor did we run second to Epaminondas." This epigram, which is put up on a trophy, a memorial to the victory at Leuctra, was one of many that announced that Sparta's day as hegemon of Greece had passed. But Thebes wasn't really in a position to replace it. The Thebans in 370 BC, that is the year after Leuctra, under Epaminondas, invaded the Peloponnesus. They could not capture Sparta, but they did set up a series of alliances with Argos, the traditional enemy of Sparta, with a new Arcadian League in central Peloponnesus, where they built a federal capital called Megalopolis, which simply means big city, and the city-state of Messene, which had been subject to the Spartans for almost 400 years, was liberated in southwestern Peloponnesus, and this band of allies across central Peloponnesus restricted Sparta to her immediate homeland. Thereafter, the Spartans would have a very tough job in trying to reassert their hegemony. The Thebans, however, really didn't have any kind of systems to forge a wider unity. And in 362 BC, at a second battle between the Spartans and Thebans, the Thebans won a victory at Mantinea in central Peloponnesus, but Epaminondas was killed. The Athenians at this point were actually allied to the Spartans. They had come to fear Theban power, which had grown so quickly. So that in 362 BC, the Thebans and Spartans had fought themselves essentially to a stalemate. The Athenians were beginning to reorganize a new naval league, but Athens was much too weak to take any kind of advantage out of this clash between Sparta and Thebes. So by 360 BC, Athens, Sparta, and Thebes had essentially fought each other to a stalemate. The Athenians found that their new naval league really was more of a burden than an advantage. The allies put all sorts of restrictions on Athenian actions. The Athenians could not collect tribute, phoros. The allies made voluntary contributions. Syntaxis is the Greek word. The Athenians found themselves with many able generals, but these generals faced two major restrictions. One is the Athenian citizen body was smaller and far more reluctant to undertake military service, unlike the 5th century BC. And second, these generals had to recruit and in addition find the money for mercenary armies as well as sailors for the fleet. And Athens was habitually short of funds in order to pay these mercenary armies, and while their generals were really quite extraordinary as tacticians, the general Iphicrates in particular innovated on light armed tactics. There were several others, Chares and Charidemos, who were regarded as very able generals in the 4th century BC, and actually both of them found employment with the great king of Persia when Athens didn't have use of them. Nonetheless, these generals did not have the resources and means to mount a recovery of the Athenian Empire. And Athens, really by 355 BC, and we'll get to this in a coming lecture, really was not in a position to play the role she had once done in the 5th century BC. So by 360 BC, literally the traditional powers of Greece were essentially politically and diplomatically deadlocked. None of them had the resources and means to assert a wider hegemony and unite the Greek world the way Sparta and Athens had done in the 5th century BC. Now, this political deadlock has often been taken as an indication of the decline of the city-state. In one way, that's true. That is, the patriotism that motivated citizens to fight against the Persians in the 5th century BC and to fight in the Great Peloponnesian War was probably no longer there. All of the Greek city-states increasingly turned to mercenaries. They turned their citizens ever more into taxpayers rather than into citizen warriors. And to some extent, these wars had sapped the patriotism, the loyalty, the sacrifice that had characterized city-states in the 5th century BC. And that goes, to some extent, towards explaining why the Greek city-states didn't offer the same kind of united resistance to Philip of Macedon and later Alexander the Great the way they did to King Xerxes of Persia. On the other hand, to then go and argue that that means that the city-state as an institution was in decline economically and socially is going too far. This has often been argued in the literature, that political decline was accompanied by economic and social decline, that Greek city-states were essentially divided between the haves and the have-nots. There was constant class warfare. The Greek term for this is stasis, a standing apart. The propertied classes were constantly at war with the lower classes, or the so-called demos, which is the Greek word for the general political citizen body, that is the Democrats. And this case has been overdrawn. Furthermore, the complicated wars of the 4th century BC in some ways stimulated economic growth. Warfare forced city-states to come up with new means of taxation, to build city walls, to make innovations in armament, equipment. Naval warfare changed dramatically. All of this put money into circulation. Furthermore, the Athenians in the 5th century BC had set the standard of what a Greek city-state should look like. There are an enormous number of building programs across the Greek world. At cities such as Olynthus, the capital of the Federal League in the Chalcidice in northern Greece, Megalopolis, the city that was the capital of the Federal League in Peloponnesus of the Arcadians. These cities are laid out as rational, organized towns according to the town planning first pioneered by Hippodamus of Miletus. There is a vast construction at the great international sanctuaries at Olympia, also at Delphi, where the great oracle is located. So building programs, social and festival activities, both within cities and the wider Greek world, all increased. And there is a good argument to be made that Greece in some ways was more wealthy in the 4th century BC than in the 5th century BC. The problem was this wealth was not at the disposal of either a Sparta, a Thebes, or an Athens that could use it to carry out a political unification of the Greek city-states. But the wealth was certainly there. Finally, there was another very important development besides what I think was the economic growth, and that was new concepts of defining Greeks. And I would like to close with this thought because it's extremely important for the upcoming lectures and accounts for some of the success of Philip II and Alexander the Great. In 380 BC, at the Olympic Games, an Athenian intellectual known as Socrates, who died in 338 BC and was born in 436 BC and essentially lived through a good deal of the late 5th and 4th century BC. He announced what later comes to be called Pan-Hellenism. He urged Sparta and Athens at the time to sink their differences and lead a coalition of Greek city-states to conquer Asia Minor from the Persians and settle it. That was a project which the Macedonian kings will be eager to do. But in addition, Socrates raises a point that Greek identity is no longer necessarily race, but the barbarians, that is the non-Greeks, who would adopt Greek institutions, live in a city-state, live under the rule of law, have the elected magistrates, assembly, council, or boule of a Greek city-state, could too become Greeks. Unwittingly, in his enthusiasm to end interstate war and urge a wider Greek alliance, Socrates created a notion that the Greek city-state could be exported to the Near East, and it would be the Macedonian kings, especially Alexander and his successors, who would do this, and this would be the means by which Hellenic civilization would be carried to the Near East. But in 360 BC, this was in the distant future, and no one expected that the Macedonians would bring unity to Greece.